Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Miha Walsh, and I'm the Executive Director of the Asian Cultural Council, and I am delighted to welcome you here tonight. I was just in the green room earlier with Peter, and he is so warm and friendly and smart and brilliant and has such enthusiasm for life. It's just infectious, and I just am standing here with incredible excitement now. I'd like to tell you a few words about the Asian Cultural Council and this event tonight before I introduce Peter. The Asian Cultural Council was founded in 1963 with the belief that the fostering of cultural relations could be a form of insurance for the future of this dangerous but exciting world. We exist and continue to work with the conviction that through an investment in creative individuals, we can build meaningful cross-cultural connections and long-lasting relationships across borders and divides. Since its founding, ACC has supported nearly 6,000 exchanges in more than 25 countries by awarding grants to artists and cultural specialists in over 15 different artistic disciplines. We believe that when an individual has the chance to be immersed in another culture, a special and transformative learning happens. This experience is not only about the rich discovery of another country, culture, and people, but also a particular opportunity to learn about oneself. Further, the ACC trusts that creative individuals have an unparalleled human capacity to explore, learn, and absorb. We believe that artists and scholars of arts and culture are uniquely positioned to connect and share. And we know that this kind of exchange enables continued dialogue, creates empathy, and cultivates respect. And we know that this is essential to building a more humane and peaceful world. Today, the importance of creating meaningful connection, understanding, and respect is critical if we are going to hope and work together. Tonight, it is with this commitment to the values of cultural exchange and securing a better world in the future that I am particularly excited to welcome you to the East-West Dialogue. This annual lecture series was conceived as a platform to engage distinguished thought leaders from the arts and cultural fields to encourage critical and new thinking and to promote mutual understanding. And I would like to thank Shoji and Suneko Sadao for their generous endowment gift to the Asian Cultural Council, which makes this ongoing series possible. Tonight's lecture is also especially meaningful because it is serving as the keynote to the ACC Forum, Making the Case for Cultural Exchange, a two-day convening which will explore the importance of cultural exchange in the world today. This gathering is taking place tomorrow and Wednesday here at NYU, and we are deeply grateful to the Henry Luce Foundation for their generous funding, which has made this forum possible. I would also like to acknowledge and thank NYU's John Bradmus Center. They have been wonderful partners in conceptualizing and producing this convening and for their generous donation of space and more here at NYU. And now I am honored to introduce our most distinguished speaker, Peter Sellars. Peter is known around the world for his groundbreaking interpretations of artistic masterpieces and for his collaborative projects with an extraordinary range of creative artists. He is a distinguished professor in the Department of World Arts and Cultures at UCLA. He is a renowned director of major artistic festivals around the world, and he is a recipient of numerous fellowships, awards, and prizes. A summary of some, but not all, of his many artistic achievements over the course of an extraordinary career can be found in this evening's program. And while there are so many brilliant facets to Peter, for ACC, there is one that shines especially brightly. Peter is a connector. He connects ideas and people across borders of all kinds and shows us that those borders are only illusions. His generosity of spirit is legendary, and in practical terms, this extends to us here tonight as Peter flew in from Amsterdam yesterday to spend 30 hours with us here in New York before he flies out to Dusseldorf tonight at midnight to continue the tour of his collaborative work he made with flex dance pioneer Reggie Gray and a group of 21 dancers from the New York City Flex on Flexin', a powerful work confronting issues of social justice in America. We at the ACC have known Peter for years as a mentor to many of our grantees we supported during their studies at UCLA, and a collaborator and a commissioner of work by our alumni from across Asia. In these roles, Peter has connected countless artists in Asia to their peers and audiences in the United States, Europe, and beyond, and continues to maintain these relationships over decades. At ACC, we often invoke the philosophy of our founder, who believed in the power of the individual to change the world. Peter has changed the world. He has done so by spreading connections and sharing beauty and optimism, even in troubling times such as we now face. We thank him for joining us tonight and sharing his inspiring ideas and about his passions. In the spirit of tonight's purpose, connection, and exchange, Peter will take questions at the end of his talk and engage in a dialogue with you. So now, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, let me please welcome the extraordinary Peter Sellars.
Good evening, cultural mavens. This is a group of people I would not miss no matter what. Any amount of flying is absolutely a pleasure when we can be here and actually be levitating together at the real moment of breakthrough, because of course until things get really bad, they're not going to get good. And so many things that we have been doing for years and a little bit take for granted, suddenly when everything's under threat, you begin to realize what you have and what you don't have. And you begin to realize certain things you took for granted, and you actually have to say, not just that the world went berserk a few months ago, but that actually, for a long time, things have not been good enough at all. And it's maybe time to retrace our steps and go back and start again, more deeply, more focused, and with a more intense sense of what the actual stakes are. So, in fact, it's an amazing time to be alive because everything counts. And the Asian Cultural Council has been doing its miraculous work for decades. But suddenly that work is not an interesting addition to the general surround. It actually is essential to the survival of the species. And we're in a place now where the threat of reversal is so intense that the work of the council and related foundations becomes the pioneering work in our country. I was just 2 weeks ago in the extreme west of China, northwest of China, with Miriam, and we were at a place that was for about 10 centuries the westernmost border of China, with Tibet, Mongolia, etc. And it's a very wild place just at the edge of the Taklamakan and Gobi deserts. And the Great Wall of China is about 5 feet high. Way out there in the desert. There's nothing to build it with. And there's this pathetic little wall, and then there's vast desert as far as you can see on one side, and vast desert as far as you can see on the other side. And you say, building a wall is a really pathetic thing to do. You just can't miss how stupid it is to build a wall there. You know, like, it gives you the idiocy of all walls. And it's just kind of magnificent to see the hopelessness that you're going to keep somebody out. You know, it won't happen. Sorry. You know, you can build your wall as much as you want. It won't work ever. Meanwhile, it also emphasizes the fact that the walls are not made out of brick. The walls are mental. And the real walls we have to bring down, pierce, and transform are internalized. In each of us, we buy into them, we accept them, and we become part of that wall, or we become the break in that wall. And this moment in history is calling on us to stand and to move. And that power of moving through the mental walls belongs to each of us. It doesn't need an institution. It doesn't need the Department of State. It actually just needs one person meeting another person to eliminate all walls, to demonstrate the idiocy of all walls. That word is friendship. That's the most profound thing that can happen against the walls. And what we're talking about is how we share the planet, how we share the water, how we share the air, how we share every single thing on this planet. Because right now, one small part of the planet is consuming, of course, 90% of the planet's resources. What does it mean to readjust that in our lifetime, in our century, and begin to actually create a more equal planet? A more equal planet where it's not just some of us who are allowed to travel, while huge populations dream of traveling and the answer is no. Or where travel is, you have to leave your home in the middle of the night as people raid the city you're living in. And the great Muslim philosopher Al-Ghazali has one of my favorite books, which is on the ethics of travel. And Al-Ghazali speaks so beautifully of the outer journey, but of course, the inner journey is the real trip. What is the inner journey that each of us are taking every day, even when we're just sitting in our homes? Where is that inner journey? How does the inner journey work? It's not just about moving through space. It's about moving through our soul, moving through our mind, moving through our imagination, and recognizing movement as the given of being human. And further, sharing. That there's not one thing that we have that belongs to us. Everything any of us have, whether it's an idea or a chair or a peach, came from someone else. There's not one thing that any of us has ever done alone, ever. So what does it mean to acknowledge and recognize the community from which everything you touch and everything you imagine has come? And to actually recognize how embedded we all are in an incredible international series of exchanges. And just ask yourself where everything you eat comes from. Ask yourself where everything you're wearing is coming from. Before the Asian Cultural Council was bringing artists from Bangladesh, guess what? underwear companies were making all their underwear in Bangladesh, and so I would just say, your closest friend tonight, underneath everything else you're wearing, the fingers of Bangladeshi teenagers are touching your body. Because that's who made that underwear. In fact, we're already living in a porous, interconnected world. The difference is how much of it we acknowledge. This year, United States spent over $22 billion in Afghanistan. Now, how many American citizens have ever met any Afghani person, have any experience of Afghani culture, have any human context for $22 billion of military outlay? Where is the cultural part of that picture? We are engaged in the longest war in the history of our country with a country that we know nothing about and whose people we have yet to meet. It's worth taking a trip to Fremont, California, which is where the Afghani artists in exile are living, with one of the most amazing exile communities of the most brilliant musicians, brilliant painters, brilliant poets. And when you're in the Bay Area, it's just one end of the subway line, Fremont. Take the subway all the way to the end and have the most amazing food and hear real music. Now, how many Americans have any idea where the Afghanis are in America? For me, it's just a very simple question of look at the front page of the newspaper every day and then ask yourself, what is the cultural content of that story? Where is the cultural dimension of what we're talking about? Everything is presented to us every day as military or economic strategy. But it isn't, it's human. It's human with human consequences, ethics, belief, philosophy, hope, joy, despair, and courage. Now, how do we locate all of those things? How do we locate all of those things in every single article in the newspaper and all the articles that do not appear in the newspaper about what's really going on? Just to say a few quick things, the way my life was changed. I grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, important melting pot of Hungarian, African American, and Syrian populations. And I apprenticed starting at the age of 10 at a marionette theater run by a woman named Margot Lovelace, who, pre-Asian Cultural Council, every summer decided to go somewhere in the world and learn about art. She would spend a summer in Moscow, a summer in the Yucatan, a summer in Osaka, Japan, and then come back to Pittsburgh and teach us kids bunraku, Mayan mask culture, or the great Soviet puppet tradition. So growing up in Pittsburgh, a working class steel town, on the weekends, I could go to this garage painted fuchsia and see incredible Balinese masks, puppets from India, Latin American ritual paraphernalia hanging on the walls of this magical place. And on top of it, they decided the puppet shows for children were basically Hansel and Gretel and Rumpelstiltskin, but they set Rumpelstiltskin in Egypt. They put Beauty and the Beast in Japan. And so we studied Japanese costume and textile and music. We studied Arab dance. All of these things were part of putting on little puppet shows. And so there in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, was this amazing cultural, astonishing cultural phenomenon of one woman who decided to educate herself and educate everyone around her. And, of course, transform my imagination completely. I then went to live in Paris when I was 18 and hung out with Javanese wayang kulit performers, with Cambodian dancers, with the range of who was in Paris in 1975, including Bob Wilson and John Cage, because the entire American avant-garde was in Europe. And of course, we were all meeting each other, seeing each other's work. All of Bob Wilson's work, all of John Cage's work, was because of their connection to Asian culture. Profoundly. So the American avant-garde could not be mentioned in a separate paragraph from Asian culture. What was American was actually deeply Asian. That thrilling moment where the American avant-garde and Asian traditional art forms were all living in Paris in the 70s. Then went one more step in my life when my mother in 1980 moved to Japan for 5 years. And so I had a place to stay in Asia for 5 years and could travel and get to know artists very, very deeply and spend quiet, quality time really beginning to understand how certain art forms functioned and being with artists not just for a year, but over a span of time to be able to see how the work developed. And then that completely changed everything I thought I was doing. So from those years, of course, I created Nixon in China, a whole bunch of things that were this project of how can I do Chinese opera in America? I was so thrilled by Chinese opera. Now, what would the American version of that be? Nixon in China, of course, where I could finally do a full-blown Chinese opera, but not fake it, but make something that was authentic in its own cultural context. Meanwhile, then I moved to California in the 80s. And the power of not being in New York was tremendous. Just because in New York has the European issues of it's just cold outside. And so, for some reason, you have to go indoors. And so, Haydn wrote string quartets, that kind of thing. What's amazing, of course, about California is you realize you don't have to go inside. And suddenly, culture that is connected to the landscape, culture that is mostly a response to the landscape, an engagement of the landscape, and that recognizes that human beings are not separate from nature, but part of nature. And where the cultural act is actually to deepen and recognize the connection between man and nature. And go profoundly into the growth patterns that are inside all of our bodies, all of our beings. And what it means, of course, to begin to slow down our metabolism so we can recognize what's happening. One of my great nights was, I was on the same program with the Dagar brothers. Do people know the Dagar brothers here? Oh my God. The Dagar brothers they practice a form of chant that's pre-Vedic. And the Dagar family goes back 500 years. It's a real dynasty. And they chant without using any words, because for them, words are incredibly imprecise. And the only precision is music. And so they chant on certain vowel sounds, and it is a healing practice. And they will take a certain vowel sound and chant for the next hour and a half on that vowel sound. And the music is profoundly transformative. And I grew up with lots of CDs of the Dagar brothers. There are different Dagar brothers in every generation, so the CDs go back to the 50s now. They're wild. And finally, I was on the same program as the Dagar brothers. I couldn't believe I was meeting them. I was at dinner with them. These people I had admired for 15 years, I worshipped. There they were right across the table. So I was just overwhelmed to be in the same city. We were in Austria. And I said, I've always dreamed of meeting you. I live in Los Angeles. One of the brothers said, we've just come from Los Angeles. I was really shocked. But of course, that's what always happens in America with so many artists that are invited by communities. There's no ad in the newspaper. They perform in the Hilton at the airport. Or the community itself takes care of the group of artists, and nobody realizes who was here. The Dagars had spent 3 months in Los Angeles. I said, oh my God, how can you practice this art form that is so slow in Los Angeles where everything is so fast? One of the brothers looked right through me with laser eyes and just said, life is always slow. Only your mind is fast. Whoa. And of course, the understanding in so much Asian culture is the actual pace of life is the pace of a child growing, a tree growing. If you look, you don't see it. But profound transformation is underway. And what does it mean to slow your metabolism and your mind down to the place where you understand and participate in meaningful change and transformation? And you enter that change in your own body and become part of it. Those experiences with artists in California completely changed my life and completely changed what I thought we were doing. My work, which had been seen at BAM and places like that before, suddenly that was over because my work changed completely and was really different from a lot of other New York work. And my emphasis in all my work became not about me, but became about recognizing everything is moving through a community. And every gesture is owned by the community. And the history is held by a community. And the future is held by a community. And so the question is the dynamic within the community. And that's actually our work. And I want to just share with you two more little anecdotes. We were very privileged in Los Angeles to have, during Tiananmen massacre, a group of the Kunshu opera was touring the United States. And when Tiananmen broke out, they decided not to go back. And they were living in Los Angeles and San Francisco incognito. They didn't want to reveal that they were here. They didn't want repercussions for their families back in China. And so they were working in Chinese restaurants in Los Angeles. And so the person who took your broccoli plate away is the greatest monkey king acrobat in the world. Working with Susan Purcell Jane in the Los Angeles Festival, we met them. We invited them to perform. here as Americans and show Americans their art form, not just a Chinese audience. Because, of course, in California, Chinese opera was heard before Western opera in 1849. The first opera theater in San Francisco was for Chinese opera. And Western critics came and reviewed the Chinese opera in 1849, 1850, and 1852. And the Chinese opera troupes toured the gold rush towns. What's very overwhelming, of course, now you know the cream of Chinese opera performers live in Flushing, across the river. But at that moment, this group of people had just arrived. The question of what their future was in America is very much on my mind because the future of opera is very interesting. The largest cultural organization in the United States of America is the Metropolitan Opera, which is the result of Russian, German, and Italian immigrants moving to New York in the 19th century. So I'm holding my breath for Chinese opera 100 years from now in America. And what became very moving, I mean, that the performances they gave for those evenings, community showed up, there was so much emotion. But also, nobody wanted to leave the theater at the end of the night because the next day it was going back to the restaurants. So we would be at 4 in the morning just talking and talking and talking in the theater. So I said, okay, let's do a project together. And I began to work with a woman named Hua Wenyi, who is the single most renowned and beloved star of Chinese opera. Now here's where I'm going to take you on a little cultural trip, which is in the 1920s in Europe, a Chinese star named Meilhan Fang toured with his company, Russia, Germany, England, France. Who saw Meilhan Fang's performances? Meyerhold, Eisenstein, Brecht. The day after Brecht saw Meilhan Fang's performance, Bertolt Brecht created his alienation theory. Meilhan Fang performing on that tour changed modern theater in the West forever. Did these guys understand what they were seeing? Absolutely not. Which is, of course, the miracle of cultural transformation, is that even profound misunderstanding creates incredible cultural results. And Brecht had no way of having a conversation with Meilhan Fang. Sergei Eisenstein had no way of having a conversation with Meilhan Fang, but seeing this amazing Chinese tradition of clear movements that end every scene. Of course, Eisenstein thought of montage theory, of putting things next to each other with this join, very contrasting elements. And a lot of Eisenstein's cinematic theory and of film editing came from seeing Chinese theater. What was amazing is Madame Hua Wenyi was the last student of Meilhan Fang. Already during the Maoist time, so she also was one of Mao's girlfriends, because that was also the job description. And there we were in Alhambra, California. And I was working with Meilhan Fang's last student. But unlike Bertolt Brecht, we could have a conversation. I could say, oh, what is that hand movement? Oh, what are you doing when you do this? And when your eyes go there, what is that? And she could explain to me what she was doing. Meanwhile, the bizarre thing is because she grew up in Mao's China, I had read, being from California, all of the key Mahayana sutras. the Flower Ornament Sutra, which is where all the beautiful flower gestures come from. She had never read any of those texts. So here I was, a Californian, supplying part of her own tradition to her. Which, of course, is this amazing fact of our lives now, is nobody's playing with a full deck. Everybody has the cards you're missing. That's what's so powerful, is all of us actually are now interdependent, and somebody has what you need from your own tradition that you no longer have. And we got into a very, very intense 8-year collaboration, and Yi and I did residencies in universities across America for 8 years so that I could learn more about Chinese opera. And we combined them in interesting ways. So we were working on Peony Pavilion, Mudan Ting, the great Ming Dynasty, classic. So we spent 7 weeks at Princeton with Tony Morrison because Mudan Ting is about ghosts. And so we said, okay, let's be with the great American writer about ghosts and look at these Chinese Ming Dynasty ghosts through the eyes of Tony Morrison. Let's begin to open up what the Chinese tradition is, but also what parts of the Chinese tradition are shared and are existing in parallel forms, or maybe the same forms, or maybe completely different forms. And let us look at what we share, what we mutually understand, and what we absolutely don't understand about each other at all. And recognize the value of all three. My training in the Worcester Group was understanding that you only make art out of things you don't understand. That's the difference between artists and politicians. Politicians think they know something and then proceed to tell you about it. Artists understand that first gesture is humility, is acknowledging everything you don't know. Acknowledging everything you don't understand. That's the beginning. That is the first step. And that gesture of humility and opening yourself to everything you can't conceive of is the way you make an original work, because you're willing to surrender and to remain vulnerable, open, searching, and in a mode of discovery. What became very interesting was I, of course, had my opinions about the Kunshu tradition, and what I couldn't stand is the way the male characters are performed. It's horrible. And it has I won't bore you with the whole history of it, but suffice it to say, for the last century and a half, the men are just stupid, and the tradition is obnoxious, and I said, okay, that's it. I said to Yi, we have to embark on this together, but some things have to change. And she was shocking. She looked at me, I will do this with Miriam, and she said, you must make everything new. She said, if I do old, I go back Shanghai. I'm here, Los Angeles, everything new. Make it new. So it's incredible when the tradition bearer says everything must be new. That's amazing. And where she says, I'm not going back to Shanghai. I need myself to reinvent every part of who I am. And she is the most distinguished performer in the tradition. So we had a series of auditions for 3 months for who could be the male figure who plays next to her. And we auditioned such an amazing range of performers from different Asian traditions, from different American traditions. The performer she picked as her leading man, I won't tell you some of the hilarious stories of these auditions because many of them are artists we admire, but just to say, the person she picked was Michael Schumacher of Bill Forsythe's Frankfurt Ballet. And the language that interested her to go next to Ming Dynasty Kunshu gestures was Bill Forsyth's language. She was totally into the avant-garde. The Western avant-garde as the next step in Kunshu. Those rehearsals became very powerful because we could do a performance that would not have been allowed in China. The subject matter of Peony Pavilion is very intense, and I think you may recognize it as an American story. The young woman who Hua Wenyi impersonates, named Du Linyang, knows something doesn't feel right in her life. She is in a lovely family. Her parents are very wealthy. Her father is the future Prime Minister of China. But something doesn't feel right. She goes to the garden behind her house. The forbidden garden where everything is in bloom. Intoxicatingly. And she falls asleep. And she has a dream. And the man of her dreams appears. They have serious, fabulous makeout session. In Chinese poetry, that's called clouds and rain. And after lots of clouds and rain, she wakes up. And Mr. Perfect is gone. And she becomes very depressed. Her parents say, "We have Mr. Right already for you." And they show her their Mr. Right. And she just looks and says, "Absolutely not. Absolutely not." And then they produce another Mr. Right. She says, "Absolutely not." She says, "I have seen the man I want in my dreams. I will wait." And she begins an incredible gesture of a hunger strike in her own family. And this we know from America, surrounded by endless material culture and wealth and well-being. Somebody is starving to death. Starving because there's another hunger that has not been answered. A deeper hunger. And she dies. Her final aria, as she leaves this world, is shocking. Then the play is in 66 scenes, so it would take 10 days to perform. No, 6 days to perform. What happens is her boyfriend is a real person who she saw, and it's a poor student who's traveling around China. 3 years after she dies, her family is making the ceremony that you make for somebody who died unhappily. Because it's understood that if there's an unhappy spirit, it will ruin all of our lives. And so gestures have to be made to let that spirit know we care, we understand they left the world in pain. And we're making offerings to them. Her family comes to a temple to make offerings to her spirit. That temple happens to be where her Jack Kerouac student boyfriend, having no place to sleep, just is sleeping under the eaves of the temple. Her spirit comes back, summoned by the incense, and there is Mr. Perfect asleep in a corner, not having taken a shower for months. But she loves him, and he's real. I will cut to the next part of the story, which is just that his courage brings her back from the dead. And there are these scenes that are spectacular as this poor student brings her spirit back into the world and she reappears here. They're hair-raising and thrilling. Then he has to study and pass the imperial exam because that was the only way you can go forward. So he does, and he studies really hard, takes the exam, and then they go off and live in a small town and have their fabulous clouds and rain. And it's real. And then her father is made Prime Minister of China. And she says to her boyfriend, you know, you should go tell my dad that I'm alive. So for the banquet of the incoming prime minister, to congratulate him, a student shows up at the door, pounding on the door of the banquet hall, and says, I have to speak to the prime minister. Everyone said, are you kidding? Get out of here, kid. And he keeps pounding and pounding and pounding. No, no, it's urgent. I have to speak to the prime minister. And finally, he bursts in at the ceremonial dinner to celebrate the prime minister and says, sir, I'm here to tell you your daughter is alive. The prime minister is horrified. The greatest, worst secret of his life is that his daughter committed suicide. On the happiest day of his life, someone is throwing this right in his face. He's horrified. He orders the student to be taken and put in prison. And then the prime minister goes and visits the student in prison and personally tortures him. And the student screams, your daughter is alive. And the prime minister says, I will torture you until you stop saying that. And the student keeps screaming, your daughter is alive. Meanwhile, only one person in all of China has passed the imperial exam. But guess what? No one can find him because he's in prison. The prime minister returns for a torture session. The student screams, your daughter is alive. And finally, Du Linyang comes back into the prison and confronts her father. And her father looks at her and says, you're not my daughter, you are a ghost. Because even when she was alive, the first time, he never really saw her. Now, in China, it's only the first third of the story that is ever performed. What's very interesting about performing that text in the West is we're able to perform scenes that cannot be played in China. And with Hua Wenyi, she was able to invent scenes that there was no tradition for, because those scenes have not been allowed in anyone's memory. So, can I just say, EastWest Exchange, we each are searching. We each have our hungers. We each have what's missing in our lives. We each have what we're searching for. We each have a dream. Of course, I was very moved in 1989 by the dream and the hunger strike of the students in Tiananmen Square lying down on the pavement. And their parents said, please, please don't do this. You have no idea what we've been through to get things this good. And those young people looked at their parents and says, no, the China you are offering us is not something we recognize. We dream of another China. Culture is a powerful thing. It's actually the most powerful thing. Governments come and go. The truth will not change. And the truth lives past one generation. Lives for many generations. As artists, we're here to deal with those truths. And those truths, which of course, when we allow them to enter our lives, change everything. The mental walls have to crumble. We have to surrender so many ideas that we thought were fixed. And we have to experience courage. What's powerful is artists can do the courageous work that most people don't dare to do. Because as artists, we have nothing to lose. We have only to gain. And we're working in a tradition that was never easy. All the people before us were in jail. If I look at the great composers in Western tradition, our lives are so easy. Mozart dying and thinking that his work was terrible. Bach not being able to write for anyone who is alive and spending the last 20 years of his life writing for people who are not yet born. The courage of artists to move into the areas the whole society needs to move into. But the whole society is afraid. And it needs the courageous example of an artist who puts their body where their belief system is. Most of us, we have our belief system, and we have what we do every day in our body. The tradition of the Asian arts is that tradition of looking inward and then having that mental and spiritual discipline go through every vein of your body. I maybe just should mention two more things, if I may. The Asian Cultural Council brought many, many amazing Indonesian artists to this country. What's very powerful is to have young artists who are going to be the change agents of their generation have access to the highest educational opportunities in the West, and to be able to move back and forth across worlds, across cultures, across economies, across political worlds. Just because most of us, because we don't move across, wherever we are, we think that's the world. And what's so beautiful about artists being offered the opportunity to leave and return is to begin to realize this is not the world. And that is not the world. And to be able to look both of those things and recognize where the hunger is, where the hunger is. Who needs to be fed? Who needs to be fed? How do we feed them? How do we feed them here? How do we feed them here? What is the nature of the hunger in each place, in each situation, in each culture? And again, to recognize violence, violence against women, violence of one group of people to another is cultural. And if you want to move against violence, there's only one way to move. We have the proof that stationing an army in somebody's neighborhood will not lower the level of violence. The only way, if you actually are interested in world peace and understanding, hire artists. Hire artists and put them everywhere. We all know from our own family, violence is the result of lack of communication. When somebody feels in your own family that they're not able to speak at dinner, no one will hear them anyway, so it's not worth saying anything. This vacuum is eventually filled with violence. And we know it in our own families. There needs to be dialogue, there needs to be reciprocity, there needs to be something moving equally in both directions. And when there isn't, and you still can't see me every day, then I have to put a bomb in your car so that you know that I exist. Art was invented as a way to say something difficult and complicated. I always think of it as, How will you tell your dad something he doesn't want to hear? He knows all the answers. He thinks he's helping everyone, and he's destroying everything. But you can't tell him that. So art was invented. You have to say something difficult to your dad with love and with skill. Because if you're not skillful, everything will get a lot worse very quickly. So the word art means skill. You can't just blunder. You have to say something difficult and painful very beautifully. And every move, gesture, word, thought, look needs to be beautifully chosen. And again, to move against the violence so there is not an increase of violence, it has to be a beauty that melts everybody's heart. Which is why these artistic traditions of such ineffable beauty were born from. Understanding that it's only going to be an act of grace that has your father let go of his horrible ideas. There has to be something irresistible that he can't push away and that breaks through the hardest heart. And in order to do that, you can't think about yourself, you have to think about him. You actually can't approach selfishly because selfishness is the crisis. So there has to be a shared understanding of each other. You have to figure out how to reach deeply to communicate. But if you don't know somebody, you can't reach deeply. So step one is you have to know who you're trying to speak to. Asian Cultural Council has been bringing people not for a month, not for 2 months, but for years. What it means that young artists get to penetrate the culture, get to be part of a culture, get to see a culture from inside and outside at the same time, which is, of course, the way all of us need to see ourselves and each other. Deep understanding both of the interior journey and the exterior journey. And the results, if I may say, are much more powerful than the way business operates. It's not that we're going to put toothpaste, our brand of toothpaste, in every house tomorrow. And it's not that we're going to convince everybody who to vote for. Art operates so much more deeply. And may I just say, for everybody in this room who is working necessarily on a small scale, thank God you're working on a small scale. The larger the scale, the less integrity. And you have to actually recognize the scale is part of the integrity. You don't want to operate at a Maoist level. Because guess what happens? The most noble ideas are transformed into something that is a nightmare. Just because of what the scale does. The scale has to be an integrity that is shared across a community, where every person in the community is morally responsible for holding the integrity of the project. And we can look in each other's eyes and hold each other to a level of honesty. One of the big issues in Asia right now with many of the classical performing arts is that there's no audience. And so many traditional artists in Asia are performing for tourists. As soon as you are performing for people who don't know what they're looking at, you stop performing well. You need someone who knows what they're looking at so that you stay on your game. the tourist audience is the end of the art form. And so much culture right now is just being made for tourists. Meanwhile, it's not as if the world doesn't have things that urgently need to be discussed. Urgently need to be discussed. And in fact, the traditional art forms were created as a way to hold those discussions. And so it's very important that all of us don't simply repeat the gesture, but we have to understand the gesture in some new way, in some deeper way, or there needs to be another gesture. If I might quote Madame Wawonyi, it must be new. And that chance that right now, when the world is so hungry, we can make it new. And we can make it new in a way that reaches across the wall, reaches through the wall, and creates a completely new shared universe, which is neither my world or your world, but is a new possibility that neither of us had before. The work of the Asian Cultural Council, the work of all of this exchange, is to invite everybody to think more deeply, to look more deeply, and to imagine more deeply. To move out of our assumption. And that's what you do when you're in a culture where you don't understand anything and you're not at home. You have to learn. You have to open yourself. Sometimes it's unpleasant, but of course it's transformative. And then you have to look back at who you thought you were and recognize what is useful about that and what is definitely has to be thrown away. We're all on earth to transform. That is why we're here as human beings, is not to be who we thought we were, but to become who we could not even have imagined. I always tell my students, you must travel because you've only met the you that your parents and friends know. And that's not who you are, because you're so busy performing for them. What is it when you're with people who you don't know how to perform for them? Who are you? Who are all those other yous that you haven't met yet? And what allows all of us to reimagine our identities? Because everybody's trapped in an identity that is too tight. All of us need more room than we have. All of us are trapped in who people think we are and what we think our possibilities are. All of those are the mental walls. And we are in prisons of our own devising. Who is holding the key to your prison and can unlock the door? One of my favorite statements is by a friend who's no longer living, who taught African American theater in Los Angeles. And she said, in China, in front of every temple, there are lion statues. And on ceremonial days, they do the lion dance. There are no lions in China. That's how culture works. It's better than Procter & Gamble. It's not just about getting the toothpaste in every convenience store. It's about what are those lions doing in China that came all the way from Africa and are now Chinese? Like Chinese poodles. It's a thrilling thing to see the lions invade China. Let me just say one last thing, everyone, and just to say why I was in the western desert of China is because one of my favorite images is the Dongwang Caves. Have people heard of the Dongwang Caves or been to the Dongwang Caves? The Dongwang Caves are a series of caves in a little beautiful kind of oasis town between two giant deserts. And if you were leaving China between the 3rd and the 10th centuries, and interestingly, in the middle of that, the Tang Dynasty, Chinese were interested in things that were not Chinese. And as you know, many of those dynasties were not Chinese ethnicities. And so suddenly the whole world was in China in a very exciting way. And Chinese knew there were things they didn't have. Buddhism was one of them, so they had to send to India and bring people from somewhere else to complete their culture. In those days, you had to take what is now called the Silk Road, which is a term I hate because there's not one bit of silk in that road at all. It is brutal. You have to go through 2 deserts. Taklamakan Desert, the word Taklamakan is from the Turkic. It means you go in and you do not come out. It's huge shifting dunes. And where you thought you were going doesn't exist anymore because the dunes all moved. And your caravan is simply wiped out in an avalanche of sand. So many people don't make it. The Gobi Desert on the other side is just depressing. It's just volcanic ash forever. So whichever way you're going, you've gone through one desert, and you have another desert to go when you reach this oasis town. So people made offerings in caves. And across 600 years, there are 600 caves, which are painted on the inside like Bill Viola installation works from the 6th century. It is video from the 6th century. It is this incredible pre-cinema where you have just walked 1,200 miles across a desert, seeing sand and sun. And suddenly you go into this cool, dark place where the walls are filled with Buddha's images coming on the ceiling, the walls around you, the floor. All these divine beings are coming out of the walls to talk to you, all simultaneously. All the walls have pictures of musicians, incredible music ensembles, dancers. They're musicians at your eye level, but then above, where the walls meet the ceiling, there are instruments floating in the air and celestial apsaras floating with musical instruments. So there are simultaneously 3 levels of music playing all the time. The human music, the celestial music, and then the instruments that just play themselves. You have, of course, the poetry of chanting the Amitabha Sutra. Every time you say the name of Buddha, another Buddha appears on the ceiling, and the ceilings have 10,000 Buddhas on them. And the early caves, which are particularly moving, have Avalokiteshvara, the god of compassion. And you know Avalokiteshvara's name means the one who sees the sounds of the world. Synesthesia. What it means when somebody's talking to you and they're saying something, but what they're saying is not really what they mean. And you have to look deeply into their eyes and see what they're really trying to say. You listen differently because you're looking differently. And so you hear something else, which of course is the test of being human. How do you hear what people are not telling you? How do you hear what is not being said? That is the act of compassion. As I'll be right there, I know we just have 2 more minutes. Robert Thurman always talks about, we all imagine on earth that the largest things in the world are just purely evil. because we just see large evil power all around us. What it is to walk into that cave and see what is immense is compassion. What is gigantic is compassion. What has power is compassion. All of these beings are surrounding you in this cool, dark place, whispering their prayers. What's powerful is Buddha in cave 236, next to Buddha is Shiva and Ganesh. And on the ceiling are all the Chinese thunder gods. And what's powerful is because on the Silk Road, for 6 centuries, are migrating populations. The art in the caves is Iranian, Greek, Tibetan, Mongolian, Korean, Indian, all at the same time. And Buddhism begins like Hebrew and Muslim traditions. You're not allowed to show the image of a Buddha, a human image. Buddha is shown as a wheel, as a pillar, as a tree. And suddenly, from Greece, Buddha is a person. And you see across 6 centuries the iconography of Buddhism be developed in these caves by multiple populations of different ethnicities. And in some of the figures are wearing ankle bracelets. That's not very Chinese. The lapis lazuli that the incredible blue lagoons are painted with, of course, comes from Iran. And what we're now learning is the famous terracotta warriors. The DNA tests have come back from the workers' site. The workers who built the terracotta warriors, they were Iranian. So cultural exchange is not new. It's actually what was always real. Nothing else was ever real. In fact, there was no culture that was ever pure, ever. Everything is borrowed, shared, exchanged. Everything that human beings have ever done in human history. This is the real work. To acknowledge that, to enjoy that, to enter that fully, and be thankful. Thank you very much.
Wow. It's amazing. I lose every sense of time, clearly. I apologize. But
We should be somewhere else by now, but we probably are.
we are. You've taken us on a journey across worlds, through different artistic traditions, history, through people. It's just amazing to me how listening to you, we can feel hope, we can feel optimistic, we can feel challenged, and we can feel encouraged, and we can feel that we're together. And that is something that Asian Cultural Council absolutely believes in, and we are able to do because of everybody in this room. And I can't thank you enough for coming tonight and being part of that, and I can't thank Peter enough for putting words to this feeling that is so powerful. I would love to invite everybody to the reception. I did say that there would be a question and answer session.
Sorry about that.
If there is one burning question that Peter can answer in a brief way, is there one person who...
Yes. Sir.
So you mentioned at the beginning that this is a critical moment for us to be able to take stock and to realize, the opportunity we have to reapprise ourselves and to seize this moment to reinvent ourselves. It's also a very difficult moment, and so the question is, you certainly seem like a very upbeat person, but at the same time, I don't want to romanticize you. You probably have off days like everybody else. So what is the key to like getting up in the morning and saying like, you know, make it new rather than just like refusing to get out from under the covers?
I would just say two things quickly. I'll try and say them very quickly. Just, first of all, this Dung Huang Cave project, we are going to make in the next 10 years a new series of Dung Huang outside of Dung Huang projects with African, Latin American, Asian, European, and American artists all collaborating the same way these caves were made by composite groups of people, and creating a new body of collaborative work across the world as these caves are. Collaborative installations around this kind of subject matter. So every year, I'm taking 2 trips to Dung Huang with 25 artists, historians from many different traditions, musicians, dancers, filmmakers, to create 10 years of collaborative work that moved forward and that is visionary by definition. The other thing I would really emphasize, and here's where I want to thank Ralph and I want to thank the Asian Cultural Council, you never know where the surprise is. They brought Martinez Miroto, one of the most promising of the tradition of dancing meditation of Central Java, from Yogyakarta. And I ended up working with Miroto in a very unexpected way. The Gulf War hit, and the first Gulf War was not pretty. And at that time, it was unpatriotic to suggest that there was anything wrong about it. And so most American artists were not making work. I did make a work. I chose a Greek play, The Persians, and this work was so hated in America. And the artists put themselves at personal risk to perform. Americans at that time could not acknowledge what was happening on the highway of death, where 150,000 people were just being used as test material for our new bombs. And the Pentagon just had 100 miles of people to bomb and try every type of bomb that sucks your lungs out and all this stuff. One photographer very courageously photographed the bodies of the 150,000 soldiers whose bodies had been experimented upon. You may have recalled it was a scandal in the press. No newspaper allowed themselves to publish these photos. One photo was printed, but that were so repellent, and they said, no, we cannot show the public what this is. So, of course, the photographer Ken Jarecki, who lives in Montana, I contacted him. I said, I want to use your photographs. I need to show the public what is going on. He sent the photographs to me. The photographs were disgusting. The photographs were unspeakable. I could never show the public that, ever. Enter Martinez Miroto from Yogyakarta, whose tradition, profound tradition, is spirit possession and contacting the souls who have been suffering. Every night before the performance, Miroto represented all 150 soldiers. Every night before the performance, Miroto made an altar in front of one of the photographs and did an entire ceremony privately, inviting the spirit of that person to enter his body. And Miroto gave a performance that was shattering. And Americans who are so used to pushing away violence and giant statistics and see so much violence every single day that it doesn't touch them, the audiences were so shocked by a small Javanese man moving his wrist and his neck. What it means that in order to bear witness to our own culture, we had to bring an artist from Java to show us who we are. That's what you hope for. And the hope is always unexpected. It's always someone who you don't know, don't understand, who actually is holding the key to your own culture. And so I'm very hopeful every day because every day I'm meeting the most amazing people, thanks to the Asian Cultural Council and their incredible network. And every day the world is renewed. And yes, it will be new.
Peter, thank you so very, very much. And thank you, everybody, for coming tonight. This has been really extraordinary, and we are all changed because of it. And I hope we will continue the conversation. I'd like to invite all of our guests to the reception across the way, just across the hall, to continue in this dialogue. And I want to again thank you very much. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you, Asian Cultural Council.